Today I'm going to talk about the most exciting new faction, or at least partially new faction, released in 2018, despite the fact that I haven't even looked at least 4 of the ones released yet. And of course I'm talking about Innsmouth T, with their titan Dagon. Ever since the Cthulhu set came out, Innsmouth has been a beloved faction because, after all, who doesn't love the idea of dominating someone with something this cute and cuddly? But also, ever since the introduction of the Cthulhu set, Innsmouth had been more or less useless until this summer, because it didn't have the burst to do anything except attempt to set up a rush at every base, and then get stuffed by anything resembling removal or anything resembling speed from the opposing deck. It was really, really bad. But now we have an extra minion play every turn, given a very easy condition to obtain, and this is enough to convert Innsmouth from more or less useless tier to a fast rush faction that provides its own card draw at the cost of having a bit of a glass jaw for removal. If I had to describe Innsmouth simply in terms of one other faction, I would describe Innsmouth T as zombies with more early game consistency at the cost of caring about opposing removal. And that's pretty much how good the faction is now. So here's a broad overview of how do you win a game with Innsmouth T. Early on in the game, as soon as you've lined up enough locals that you can go off, getting Dagon into play and having good odds of drawing into enough locals to continue with your extra plays, you want to go aggressive as fast as possible. And the idea here is you're going to force your opponents to spend the resources from their hands on keeping up with you, rather than setting up for some sort of big play. And by the time Innsmouth starts to run out of steam, you should get to a position where you've managed to line up more power cards from your second faction into your hand, with the deck thinning of Innsmouth and the fact that you've been able to plan ahead of time based on what you revealed and stuck on the bottom of your deck with locals. Then your opponents will have left after dealing with this frenzied early rush of a whole bunch of essentially 3 power minions dropping 2 to 4 or 5 a turn, coming in like that. You should reach a close scores end game where you just have the better hand and you just win. Or you'll take a commanding lead and run away with the game. So there's 3 things that can go wrong with this kind of Innsmouth attack and attempt to just collect the game. The first is that you hit bad draw luck. Your locals don't end up being in the top 3 cards on top of your deck often enough, and you sort of fizzle out at a bad time. This happens, but it's not a big deal because the number of games that this happens to Innsmouth, assuming that you have good timing on your burst, is going to be smaller than the number of games in which some other deck just draws their cards in the wrong order and never really gets a chance to try and go off in the first place. So that's not a huge concern for Innsmouth. The second thing that you also can't do a lot about is that you get banned listed. Now, to some extent, you can deal with this in the draft. Maybe you play Rockstars as your partner faction so that banned listing locals allows groupies to go crazy. But for the most part, this is something you can't do too much about with Innsmouth, but you do have a decent chance of drawing back into more locals, maybe having a chance to reshuffle your deck and getting back into the game. So that's just one specific bad matchup against Geeks, and it's not a huge deal unless you're considering drafting Innsmouth in a game where you're already facing Geeks. The third problem is walking face first into removal. You have a few ways to deal with removal when playing Innsmouth T. And the most obvious, and the one that applies to every deck that has a lot of 2-power minions, is you can lead with bigger minions from your partner faction and save multiple plays of locals for when you're ready to play a burst, bring out Dagon, and break a base. Ideally, when you play several locals, The base should break before anyone that has any sort of area of effect, multiple destruction abilities gets a chance to take a turn, because that way it doesn't matter that they can kill your locals, because they can only kill your locals when your locals aren't there. You do also have an immunity card in plain sight. Normally, immunity cards are bad because the player with the destruction just waits for the next base and then destroys minions at that base instead. But here, Innsmouth is good enough at bursting bases that they can often drop in plain sight on that one base that they're not going to be able to burst, and they don't feel like they can afford to slow play by opening with partner faction minions and waiting a little while before bringing out Dagon. You can also consider playing Sacred Circle on an empty base as a setup turn, so that you threaten on your next turn to go locals, Dagon, immediately have Dagon's extra minion play available, and now you're working with one minion play and an action play and starting from 6 power. And that's often enough of a setup that you can threaten to break something or come very close to breaking something without ever having actually exposed locals to removal. Those are the main ways you're going to deal with removal. Think lead with partner faction minions when in danger, use big bursts to make sure that danger doesn't come up often enough, and once per game you're going to be able to drop in plain sight for an immunity, assuming of course that it doesn't get disenchanted. As far as good partners for Innsmouth, Geeks, Aliens, and Rockstars are all very strong first-pick factions that can consider Innsmouth an extremely threatening second pick that they can aim for if their opponents don't counterpick it in a draft. In the case of Geeks and Aliens, you're going to play the standard Innsmouth strategy of going forward with your locals, putting pressure on, and understanding that these two factions are fantastic at endgame insurance. In Aliens' case, some of your extra plays and Return to the Sea can get a lot more points out of invaders than you would if the game was terribly fair. You can also aim to first pick Innsmouth with some other factions that can have some broken interactions. Dinosaurs and Shapeshifters have always had a scary interaction with dropping 3 War Raptors for 15 power or dropping 3 Mimics for 15 power, and this is still just as broken, but it matters a lot more that Innsmouth has a Titan, both because it's easier to play 3 or 4 minions in the same turn, and also because Innsmouth is on its own capable of winning enough bases that the extra base that you utterly dominate from playing a broken combination is more likely to secure the game for you. Innsmouth can help the Elder Things accelerate their madness attack with multiple Byakhis or Migos, and adds a lot of consistency to Shoggoth, although it's not as aggressive as some of the others I've listed. Innsmouth Mythic Horses can play comical amounts of power, but I suspect it's quite a bit less consistent than Innsmouth Rockstars. There just seem to be more combinations of cards you could draw there that wouldn't be very good together, and you're actually likely to overkill bases a bit. And the last one I want to mention is the Innsmouth Magical Girls. Magical Girls may have a Titan, but losing out on Walking Castle isn't a very big deal, because most of the time, if you get a lot out of Walking Castle, it's either because you clash someone else's Titan, or because your opponent's done goofed somehow and allowed you to set up a lawnmower that you really shouldn't be able to set up. Just having 4 or 5 minions in play quickly means that the Magical Girl's talents are going to go rather crazy in short order. Magical Girls in general love multiple minion plays for their partner faction and enough card draw to support that, and Innsmouth provides both.